there is the risk that of veering into a little bit of what I believe the right wing calls self-esteemia, or whatever they call that. That maneuvers like that actually, it may be, are intended to make the adults feel more justified in their decisions, regardless of what the reality is. I mean, I think that what you're describing is not necessarily untrue, but it's a pretty common trope, right? That it is better to divide a household that is rife with conflict than to keep it together for the kids, right? And it's what we tell ourselves. It doesn't mean it's not true. I happen to think it's often true. And anecdotally, I'm sure we've seen cases where it's true. But I do think that that's a kind of adult-focused view rather than a kid-focused view. Very much so.
Because I think, could I just say that I think that oftentimes that, see, that's what I think about this overly, again, friendly divorce, is that it soothes the parent's conscience. Oh, look, we can divorce, and we'll do it really in a friendly manner, and all will be well. And I think I don't think the kids are heard.
Well, one thing that, I mean, this obviously reminds me of what Katie was talking about in the earlier panel about conflict and stress, or maybe it was, I think Jason and Katie were both talking about this, that the predictor of the well-being of the children is the presence or absence of conflict and stress in the household. And I think we've all probably seen households where the kids were miserable and then the parents split up and then the kids seemed much better off. And we've probably seen the reverse happen, and maybe that tracks with when the conflict is visible to the kids. Sometimes it might be legible before the parents split up. Sometimes there might be more fighting after the fact, and more of the, if your dad doesn't, tell your dad if he doesn't pay me this week, you're not going over there. That's probably a bad outcome, right? But I would think that the issue of conflict is not necessarily linked to the moment of the split, if that makes any sense. But this does, when you were talking about the cost, for example, of mediation, which is, I think by any measure, factors lower than a traditional adversarial process. And let me back up for 1 second. At least in New York, which is my jurisdiction, mediation, as briefly described here, is a process by which, not just in divorce, it happens in all areas of at least civil litigation, civil conflict. A third party who is a neutral, who is sometimes but not always a lawyer, tries to help the parties resolve whatever their dispute is, rather than each of them being separately represented in our traditional adversarial model. There are a lot of advocates for this process, a lot of people who are strongly opposed to it, some, as I am, who are highly skeptical of it. But that's sort of the model of what we're talking about here when we talk about mediation versus adversarial process. Adversarial doesn't always mean fighting. It in these United States is actually a technical term, meaning if I'm representing Naomi and Wendy is representing Daniel, we are adversaries, and we will refer to each other as such in court, and we don't even necessarily mean anything bad by it. So when I say adversarial, I don't mean fighting. I mean literally, technically, an adversarial process. Anyway, because of the cost issue that has been raised, it is without question, $40, $1,500, whatever it is, to mediate a dissolution or to mediate a dispute about child support between unmarried parents or a custody issue between unmarried parents. You have written, Naomi, extensively about I think you call it the class gap in both marriage and divorce. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about how different access to different financial resources affects people's decision making in terms of how to proceed with dissolution, particularly as society changes and wealth distribution changes.
Well, it's actually, contrasting the outcomes of what happens upon divorce versus what happens in other kinds of relationship dissolutions is really, really fascinating. And notwithstanding, Daniel, what you say about sort of making sure the children see the conflict, when the parents are married, there's much more likely to be a joint custody order, which then I think requires that the parents exhibit some cooperation, or else you'll really, really be scarring the kids. And so there's a huge gap in a variety of different ways when it comes to relationships that dissolve via divorce versus relationships that dissolve non-marially, and that does in fact track the the class gap as well in terms of who is likely to get married, but then that also means in terms of who is likely to get divorced as well. But so the different outcomes based on divorce is not just not just joint custody, but about 15% of people who are divorced get alimony. You can't get that. Obviously, you can't get that unless there's some money there, but you also can't get that outside of divorce. And when there's been divorce, the custodial parent is also much more likely to get full amounts of child support than when there hasn't been a divorce. So it's important as we talk about what's actually going on with divorce to think about all those families that we were talking about in the earlier panel, that is all of the single parent families where the outcomes post-divorce aren't as good. That the other thing is that recent Pew report on breadwinning women showed that although divorced women have their standard of living sink, they're still in much better shape than never married women. So there's this huge gap that goes on, and it also, I mean, in our conversations before the panel, we talked about it also in terms of what actually happens during the divorce process. Who's most likely to have access to these parenting education programs?
Sure. And I think, please correct me if I'm misparaphrasing you, but you've written that there is or you've said off the record that if we were to draw, say, a divorce line, right, that, and we're talking about socioeconomic class here, or just even economic, right, that those at the very top are the least likely to divorce.
Right.
And